Hi, I'm Arsham, and this series of videos about computer science and game development are sponsored by Kitakode. I've started taking a course called CS50 made by Harvard, which gives you all the knowledge you need for computer science and game development. And this series of videos are summarized versions of that course. Feel free to check it out for yourself. Now on to the video. Hello everybody and welcome to our coding area. So this coding area is basically CS50 IDE. You can go visit it. If you have an edX account, you can log into it for free. So this is basically an environment. It's a very easy environment to work with C because there's some libraries that they also provide which would be easy for us. I'll talk about what libraries are in a few moments. So let's start. Well, now we have an empty file, as you guys can see over here. Let's name it, for example, let's save it and let's name it int, since we're doing an int. And we need an extension to this file, so basically like .png, .mp4, .gif, so on and so forth. And since we're working with C, we need a .c. So that's basically, this indicates that this file that we're making is a C file and not like a Python file or JavaScript or so on and so forth. So let's save it. And now we have our int. Okay, so now we are in our file. There's a few things we need to do before we actually start coding and implementing our examples for each data type. So there are a few libraries, and a library is basically codes that other people have written that you can use in your code. So basically something that might help you doing a task that might be very difficult without it. So for example, CS50 has made a library. I'll talk about how you import it, which basically does some simple commands that C normally doesn't do. And why does it not do it? Because, well, C is a pretty low-level language, and low-level languages are basically far away from the English concept, more farther away than, for example, Python, which is a higher-level language. So C is basically closer to machine code. Okay, so let me show you how we import the library. So in this case, what we do is hashtag include. So these parts you don't really need to remember, but you can just copy it off of this video as well. So open brackets cs50.h. As you guys can see, this is how you import libraries. So include, open these brackets, and then write the name of the library .h, and then close it. And we also might need another one, but none of these we won't necessarily need them, but once we use them, they'll be here for us at our disposal. So yeah, let's get started. So we want to do an int example. So I'm getting onto that in a bit. But first of all, we need to do something before we start the example. And to run code in C, you would actually need a function or a main function. So how we define this function, and whatever's inside this function that we're going to create is going to be run by C automatically. So you don't need to wait for it, or you don't need to call it like other programming languages like Python. So let's make it. So it's called int main and then void. But for now, we don't really need to know what void int main is. We just need to have this in order for our program to work. So that's that. This is pretty simple. So basically these curly brackets are basically indicating that whatever's inside here is going to be run. And this is an indentation. Basically it's very important. As you guys can see, there's a space here over here, and we need that to indicate that the code that we're writing here is inside our function. Okay, so now we have this ready and now we understand. Now let's get on to coding. Okay, so now we want to make basically just a variable or two variables, and we want to add them up. So let's do that. So how we create a variable, as I talked about in the previous video, which is a shorter video about how you make variables or declaration, initialization, and assigning values to it. So let's make one. So we want it to be an integer, of course. So we do int, and let's name it, for example, a, or just num1, num_1. These are good ways to name stuff. So then we make it equal to, which basically assigns a value to it, and we want to hard-code a variable. And what hard-coding means is actually basically giving it a value ourselves instead of having the user input it. So let's give it, for example, the number 5. It doesn't really matter what you give it. You can choose any number, but I choose 5. And then we want another variable. It's a number again, so int num_2 is the name of the variable, and we're assigning a value of, for example, let's say 7. So now we have two variables, and now we could deal without you having an extra variable, but I'll show you guys what I mean by we can do it mostly inline. So let's try that out. So let's try it the more extensive way first, and then we're going to shorten it down. So we have an int, and let's say total. And what we want the total to be, we want it to be the sum of num1 and num2. So num underscore 1 plus num underscore 2. So this basically adds the two numbers. And yes, I forgot to tell you guys, this thing at the end is a semicolon, and in C it's sort of like punctuation. But normally in English you could deal without it, although it might not look good or might not make sense while you're reading it. But in C it's very important. If we don't have this, in some cases it will raise an error. So we need semicolons at the ends of most of the things. Some of the things I'll get onto that don't need it necessarily, but some of the things they do. Okay, so now that we have the total, we want to print it out. So how do we do that? Well, it's pretty simple. We just use printf. And what printf does, it basically prints your whatever text, variable values, or anything formatted. So it's basically a formatted way of making text. So now we want to give the user some readability, so we write total, or you can even write your total is, there you go, and then put like a space so we can put our variable value there. And we can't just write total and just expect it to read the total variable over here. If we basically put the semicolon there, if we basically just run this code, this would say your total is colon space total. It wouldn't read the value of this variable. So how we do that is by using %i, and there are different ways. For example, this is %i, which means integer. So since the outcome of this variable is an integer, so we need to specify. This is very important in C as well. So for example, if I do %s and then I expect it to print total, it wouldn't work. It would raise an error because total is an int, not a string. So yeah, that's %i. And how does it know that which variable it should print? Well, actually it's pretty simple. Print takes many parameters in this case. So how it works basically is when you put a comma after these double quotations, you can specify which variable you want it to print. Like for example, here we want total to be printed, and you can put as many as you want, right? So you can do %i, and so on and so forth. And then you could put more commas like num1 or even num2. So as you guys can see, there's 3 %i's, and total num1 and num2 would get printed. But for now we just want the total, we don't want the others. So one more thing that we want to do is for just making it look neat, we want basically when you run this code, we want it to go a new line. I'll show you guys what I mean by now. So I won't do that formatting first, and I'll show you guys what I mean, how it looks like. As you guys can see, we're on a line in our terminal. This is our terminal, basically where we run our code, where we test our codes, more into basically command line stuff instead of graphical user interface or GUI. Basically, it's not like a place where it has buttons, more of a text-based place. So let's try it. Okay, so how do we run our code? Well, in C, it's not like a run button that you can press. It's on other programming languages you could, if the IDE, the place you're working in, has and provides that. So here we have to write make, which basically makes our file ready and compiled for a reader to read it and basically give us an output or give us our program. So what do we do next? We just make. Well, we need to put the name of our file. So make int, which is the name of our file. And as you guys can see, don't worry about this. This is just saying it worked. If it was an error, it would say an error, and it would give us a red color error. So what we have to do now is put /, and this is how you run your code. The previous one actually compiles it. Now this one is how you run it. And then we just put the name of it. So /int in this case. Now we run it. As you guys can see, we have quite a bit of a problem, but actually our code works perfectly. 7 plus 5 is indeed 12. So this works. Your total is 12, and it's reading this value of the total. But there's a problem. As you guys can see, whenever I enter a value, it goes to the next line, right? Like here, when I entered, it went to the next line and wrote, and here when I entered. But this time, it did not go to the next line. It should be here, but indeed, it's here. So that's what I was talking about in formatting ways. So basically what we need to do, let's clear our terminal. It's going to be quite buggy if we don't do that. Let's open a new terminal. Let's bring this down. And yep, okay, so what we have to do now is make int again. Actually, we haven't done it yet, so yes. And yes, I forgot to tell you guys that every time you make a change that you are happy with and you want to check, you have to make it again because it has to compile. So yes, so what we have to do here, if we want a new line, we have to put backslash and n. The backslash n, basically this creates a new line after it's done its job, basically printing out our total in this case. So let's save it and let's make int. And so it's made it, no errors, that's good. And /int. And as you guys can see, before it was on the same line, the next prompt, but now it's on the next line. So this program works perfectly. All right, okay, so now we're done with this. Now we can comment it. And what commenting is, it's basically silencing the code. So when the compiler comes in, it wouldn't read that line of code. It would just ignore it. So basically, this means you can keep your code there, but it won't be read. So how we do that in Windows, you do Control/, and on Mac you do Command/. So basically, we don't want these lines of code anymore, so we get rid of them. And this can also be used instead of just commenting lines of code that you don't want to read. You can put notes. Like for example, if I do, let's say if I don't know what this first line does. So num creates a variable for num1 and assigns a variable, or sorry, a value of 5 to it. So that's basically just for a note for the person or the programmer or another person who has to read your code. So yes, now we move on to our next example, which is for a string. And this one's a bit different since this time we are actually going to take the user's input. So how we do that is actually quite simple as well. And this actually quite a bit involves the CS50 library, and this makes it easier for us to get the person's input or prompt the user for something. But later on, we're going to take off our training wheels and we're going to do it basically how C intends us to do it instead of using the CS50 library. So let's get into it. And how we do it is basically let's make a variable, but this time instead of naming it, giving it an int data type, we're going to give it a string data type. And we're going to talk about strings later on. They're not really strings, but don't worry about that for now. So yeah, now what we want to do is just name it. So we want to get the user's name. So let's name the variable just name. Now how we do this, we can't just define hardcode a value to it, because the person who wants to gain access to this code, or in the user's standpoint, would not have access to our code. So they can't just type their name here, right? What we need to do is ask the person for their name. So how we do that is a CS50 library function, so get_string. So basically this prompts the user for a string and stores it in this variable. So what we need to do is put quotations and also a semicolon at the end. And here we want to basically write the thing that gets prompted to the user or gets asked by the user. So enter your name. So this is basically what the user sees in that state of point, but we see this here. They won't see this there. Okay, so now all we want to do is print hello, comma, and their name. So this is also pretty easy, considering we've already done it before, kind of. But I'm not gonna copy it. So print f, formatting print, and hello, comma, and we want to put their name. Again, we can't just put name because it won't read it. This time we need to put %s, as I talked about earlier. Alright, now let's move on to our char example. So our character, basically. And this one, there's going to be another type of this code I'm going to do later on, but a bit more in depth. But for now, we're going to do a simple version of it. And what we want to ask the user is basically, let's clear our console. So basically, we want to ask the user for a char or a character. So here we just write char instead of string or int. And then we ask the person for a character. Let's just name it C. And make it equal to get_char. And we could have done the get underscore for this as well, but I decided to hard code it to show you guys an example of it as well. So if you want to get an int, you just would get_int. Now we open close bracket, semicolon at the end, and we want to ask the user if they agree with something or not. So do you agree? This is basically what the user sees, and we want to put a colon and a space, and we want the user to be prompted with a yes or no answer, so Y or N in this case, let's say, for example. So now we're going to do something that we haven't really done before. It's called an if statement, and an if statements will be taught in the future upcoming videos, so don't worry about that at all. So all we have to do now is basically write if. So if basically if something happens, then something else runs. So if a condition is true, then the code inside this if statement would be run. But don't worry if it doesn't all make sense. All I'm doing in this video is basically teaching you guys the basics of data types. So yeah, now we put C equals to, and how we compare that two things are equal in programming are through equals instead of just equals. In maths, that makes sense. Like for example, if you write in math 1 equals 1, that makes sense. But in programming, if you want to compare two things, we have to put double equals, as I'll talk about later on as well. So yeah, now we want to check if it's equal to capital Y, or let's just write yes. If, sorry, it has to be a single character. So yeah, it has to be a capital Y. So since it's a char and we're getting one character only, later on we get more characters as well, but for now we are using only one character. So if the character that the person has input is equal to capital Y, and later on I'll talk about kind of this program doesn't really make sense, because if the person inputs, for example, a lowercase y or any other character, what would happen? So yes, for now we're not going to do that because that involves, for example, ORs and all those stuff, but for now I'm not going to go into it. So what we want to happen when it says when the user's input is capital letter Y. So we want to print agreed, and we want to put \n for a new line. So that's basically it. This is a very simple program. Else if. So else if, and this is something which is close to an if. You can put an if, but don't really. This is another condition besides this condition basically, and there's if, else, and else if, which I'll talk about later on, so don't worry about this, just follow along. And what we want to compare this time is C equals to capital letter N this time. And what we want to do is copy this, since we don't really need to write it again. And now this time we write not agreed. Okay, so let's test it out. So make data types /data types. And now what we do is press capital letter Y, let's say. And now it says agreed, right? Now let's run our code again. This time we didn't need to make it because we haven't made any changes in our code. We're just testing it again. Now we put capital letter N and we see not agreed. What happens if we put another letter in it or anything? It gets reprompted. So basically it's not looking for what we wanted, so it reprompts the user automatically and saying you got it wrong. Please press something that we know, like capital letter Y, and then it stops the program. Okay, so I'm going to stop this video here. This is a bit of a lengthy one. I'm going to continue in the next video talking about floats and bools. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye bye.